Title: The Untold Story of Liberty, How America Was Born. In the quiet dawn of a new world, a group of ordinary people began a journey that would change the course of history forever. They were farmers, blacksmiths, teachers, and dreamers. They lived under the rule of a mighty empire, but deep inside their hearts, they carried one powerful idea: freedom. This is not just the story of battles and leaders. It is the story of courage, hope, and the birth of a nation, a story written by people who dared to believe that all men and women have the right to live free. Today, we travel back in time, to the 18th century, to witness how 13 small colonies on the edge of North America rose up against one of the strongest empires in the world. We will see how the dream of liberty began, how it was tested in fire and blood, and how it became the foundation of a new nation, the United States of America. This is the untold story of liberty, how America was born. In the early 1700s, the land that would one day be called the United States of America was very different from the nation we know today. It was a collection of 13 colonies, stretched along the eastern coast of North America. Each colony had its own traditions, farms, and small towns. The people worked hard to build homes, plant crops, and raise families in the New World. But these colonies were not free. They belonged to Great Britain, the most powerful empire of the time. The British King, George III, ruled from far across the ocean. The colonies had their own local leaders, but they had to follow British laws and pay British taxes. For many years, life continued quietly. The colonists were proud to be part of the British Empire. They spoke the same language, followed the same customs, and traded British goods. But slowly, small seeds of discontent began to grow. The people in the colonies worked hard to survive in the wild lands of America. They built their own towns, schools, and farms without much help from England. Yet, when it came to making important decisions, about trade, laws, or taxes, they had no voice in the British Parliament. They began to ask a simple question: if we work, live, and fight for this land, why can't we have a say in how it's governed? This question would grow louder and louder in the years to come. After the costly 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, Britain was deep in debt. The government decided that the American colonies should help pay for the expenses of the war and the soldiers stationed in America. So, Britain introduced new taxes, first on sugar and later on printed papers, documents, and even playing cards. This was called the Stamp Act of 1765. For the first time, colonists had to buy official stamps for almost every piece of paper they used. It may sound small, but to them, it was a matter of principle. They believed it was unfair to pay taxes when they had no representatives in Parliament. Soon, a new phrase echoed through the colonies: no taxation without representation. This simple slogan carried a powerful message. It was not only about money, it was about freedom and self-respect. The people wanted to be treated not as subjects, but as citizens with rights. Across the colonies, people began to speak out. Writers, farmers, and merchants met in taverns and town halls. They shared their anger and their dreams of change. One of the first groups to organize was the Sons of Liberty, a secret society formed to protest British control. They wrote letters, printed newspapers, and encouraged others to resist unfair laws. Their meetings were filled with energy, passion, and sometimes, danger. When the Stamp Act was enforced, protests spread from Boston to New York and beyond. British officials were harassed, and stamps were burned in the streets. Finally, after months of strong resistance, the British government decided to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766. It was a small victory, but it gave the colonies hope. They had spoken, and they had been heard. However, not everyone in the colonies wanted to fight Britain. Some people, called loyalists, believed that breaking away from the empire was foolish and dangerous. They feared that rebellion would bring chaos and war. Others, known as patriots, felt that liberty was worth any price. They were ready to risk their lives for freedom. This division would soon tear families and friends apart. The question of freedom was no longer a distant idea. It had become a living, burning issue in every home, every shop, and every heart. By the end of the 1760s, tension filled the air. The British sent soldiers to keep order in the colonies, especially in Boston, a city full of protests and revolutionary spirit. The sight of red-coated soldiers marching through the streets made many Americans angry and afraid. The colonies were changing. A sense of American identity was growing stronger every day. People began to think of themselves not just as Englishmen living abroad, but as Americans, a people with their own values, their own dreams, and their own destiny. The seed of liberty had been planted. It was small, fragile, and uncertain. But soon, it would grow into a movement powerful enough to shake the world. The year was 1770. The city of Boston, in the colony of Massachusetts, had become the heart of American resistance. Its narrow streets, busy harbor, and proud people made it a place where ideas of freedom were spreading fast. But it was also a city under pressure. British soldiers marched through the streets every day, sent to keep peace and enforce British laws. To many Bostonians, the soldiers were not protectors, they were a symbol of control. The people felt watched, judged, and silenced in their own city. The tension grew heavier each week, like a storm waiting to break. On a cold night in March 1770, the storm finally broke. It began with angry words in front of the Custom House, where British taxes were collected. A group of colonists shouted at a British sentry, calling him names and throwing small pieces of ice and snow. The noise grew louder. More townspeople arrived, sailors, merchants, and boys. Soon, a group of British soldiers appeared, their red coats glowing under the lantern light. The crowd shouted, "Go home, and we want no tyrants here." No one planned what happened next. In the confusion, a soldier was struck by a stick, another slipped on the icy ground. Someone shouted, "Fire!" Shots rang out in the dark. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead on the cobblestones. Among them was a man named Crispus Attucks, a dock worker of African and Native American descent. He would become one of the first heroes of the American Revolution. The event shocked the colonies. The newspapers called it the Boston Massacre. To the British, it was a tragedy caused by an angry mob. To the colonists, it was proof that the king's soldiers could kill innocent men, and get away with it. The story of the massacre spread quickly. Pamphlets and letters traveled from town to town, carried by horseback and ship. Writers and speakers began to use their voices as weapons. One of the most famous was Samuel Adams, a strong leader and speaker from Boston. He knew that words could unite people faster than armies. Adams helped form committees of correspondence, which allowed colonies to share news, organize meetings, and plan actions together. The colonies were no longer isolated. They were becoming a network, a community of people connected by one dream, freedom. For a few years, things grew quiet again. But the silence was only the calm before another storm. In 1773, the British government passed the Tea Act, which allowed the East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, cheaper than local merchants could. It sounded harmless, even helpful. But the colonists saw it as another trick, another way for Britain to control them. In December 1773, something unforgettable happened. One cold night, a group of men disguised as Native Americans boarded 3 British ships in Boston Harbor. They worked quickly and silently, breaking open more than 300 chests of tea and pouring them into the dark water below. The harbor turned brown with tea. The air smelled of salt and rebellion. This daring act became known as the Boston Tea Party. To the colonists, it was a proud statement. To the British government, it was an act of open defiance. King George III was furious. He believed that the colonies had gone too far and that they needed to be punished. In response, Britain passed a series of strict laws known as the Coercive Acts, or, as the colonists called them, the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed Boston's port, stopped town meetings, and allowed British soldiers to live in colonists' homes. The punishment was meant to break Boston's spirit. But instead, it had the opposite effect. The colonies, once divided, now began to unite. They realized that if one colony could be treated so harshly, all could be next. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, from New York to Georgia, people began to stand together. They sent food, money, and supplies to help the people of Boston. The dream of freedom was no longer just Boston's, it was America's. In 1774, leaders from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia for the first time. This historic gathering was called the First Continental Congress. They met to discuss what could be done, not to declare war, but to find peace and justice. They wrote letters to the king, asking him to end the unfair laws. They agreed to stop buying British goods until their voices were heard. But beneath their calm discussions was a growing sense that peace might not be possible. Too much anger had built up. Too much blood had already been spilled. In every colony, people began to prepare quietly. Guns were cleaned. Powder was stored. Militias, small groups of citizen soldiers, began to train. The colonies were not ready for war. But they were ready for change. By the end of 1774, the world of the American colonies had changed forever. The people had found their voice, and their courage. They were no longer simply British subjects living far away from the king. They were Americans, united, determined, and hopeful. Boston, once just a single city, had become the symbol of a rising movement. And soon, that movement would explode into the first battles for independence. The spark had been lit. The fire of revolution was about to begin. The year was 1775. The air in the American colonies was heavy with tension and fear. For months, both the colonists and the British had been preparing, not openly for war, but for something that everyone felt was coming. Meetings were secret. Messages were sent quietly by horseback in the dead of night. The people were ready to defend their rights, and if necessary, their lives. The king's army was ready too. British soldiers, known as redcoats, were stationed across the colonies to keep order. But now, even their presence could not calm the growing anger. The people no longer trusted the king. They trusted only one thing, their belief in liberty. In April 1775, the British Army received orders to move. Their goal was to seize weapons and arrest leaders of the resistance in Massachusetts. The British wanted to stop the colonies before open rebellion began. But the colonists had their own network of informants. They learned of the plan before the soldiers even left Boston. Among them were two men whose names would forever be remembered, Paul Revere and William Dawes. On the night of April 18, 1775, Paul Revere mounted his horse and began his legendary ride. As he galloped through the quiet countryside, he shouted, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" House by house, village by village, his voice carried through the darkness. Farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers lit candles, grabbed muskets, and woke their neighbors. The Minutemen, named because they could be ready in a minute's notice, began to gather. The colonies were awake. The time had come. Before sunrise on April 19, 1775, British soldiers reached the small town of Lexington. There, on the village green, stood about 70 Minutemen, ordinary men holding their ground against the most powerful army in the world. For a moment, both sides stared at each other in silence. The morning air was cold and still. Then, suddenly, a shot was fired. No one knew who pulled the trigger first. But that single sound, that single shot, changed history. It became known as the shot heard around the world. Gunfire followed. When the smoke cleared, 8 Americans lay dead. The British moved on to Concord, searching for hidden weapons. But this time, the Minutemen were ready. They fired from behind stone walls, fences, and trees. By the end of the day, the British were forced to retreat back to Boston, tired, wounded, and shocked. More than 250 British soldiers had been killed or injured. The war for independence had begun. News of the battle spread quickly across the colonies. In every town, people began to arm themselves. Mothers and fathers said goodbye to sons who left to join the local militias. Blacksmiths made bullets. Farmers turned their plows into weapons. The dream of liberty was no longer just words, it was now a fight for survival. Leaders gathered again in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress in May 1775. There, they made a bold decision, to create an army to defend the colonies. And they needed a leader. After much discussion, one man was chosen, George Washington, a tall, quiet, and respected soldier from Virginia. He accepted the duty with humility, saying he hoped to be worthy of the trust placed in him. Washington would soon face one of the most difficult challenges in history, leading a group of farmers and tradesmen against the strongest military on earth. Just 2 months later, in June 1775, the first major battle of the war took place near Boston, at a hill called Bunker Hill. Thousands of British troops advanced up the hill as the American fighters waited above. They were short on ammunition, so their commander told them, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." When the British soldiers came close enough, the Americans fired in deadly unison. Wave after wave of redcoats fell to the ground. Twice, the British retreated. On the third attack, they finally took the hill, but at a terrible cost. The British lost over 1,000 men, while the Americans lost about 400. Though the colonists technically lost the battle, it proved something far more important: they could stand and fight against the world's greatest army. It was a victory of spirit. Even after these battles, many colonists still hoped for peace. The Continental Congress sent a letter to King George III, known as the Olive Branch Petition, asking for forgiveness and understanding. They wanted to stay loyal but to live with freedom and fairness. But the king refused to read the letter. Instead, he declared that the colonies were in open rebellion. He sent more ships, more troops, and more orders to crush the resistance. The chance for peace was gone. The road ahead would be long, bloody, and uncertain. By the end of 1775, everything had changed. What began as protests and petitions had turned into a full war for independence. The people were no longer just colonists, they were revolutionaries. They fought not for wealth or fame, but for a new idea, that ordinary people could govern themselves, without a king. In the quiet moments of that harsh winter, George Washington and his soldiers camped near Boston. They were hungry, cold, and poorly supplied. Yet in their hearts, a small flame of hope burned bright. They did not know if they would win. They only knew that freedom was worth fighting for. And that fight, the battle for the soul of a nation, had only just begun. The year was 1776, a year that would forever change the course of history. Across the 13 colonies, the sound of drums, muskets, and marching feet filled the air. War had already begun, but the people still fought under the banner of the British Crown. They were rebels, not yet a nation, but now, the time had come for something greater, a bold statement that would give their struggle a new name and a new purpose. That statement was called the Declaration of Independence. For months, the Second Continental Congress had been meeting in Philadelphia, inside a building that would later be known as Independence Hall. The delegates came from every colony, men with different beliefs, accents, and experiences. Some were farmers and merchants. Others were lawyers, writers, or soldiers. They all agreed on one thing: the colonies deserved to live free. But how far were they willing to go? Were they ready to break ties completely with Great Britain, the most powerful empire in the world? It was not an easy decision. Declaring independence was dangerous. If they failed, every man who signed such a declaration could be hanged for treason. Still, the voices for freedom grew louder every day. Among the strongest voices was Thomas Paine, a writer from England who had moved to America. In January 1776, he published a pamphlet called Common Sense. It was written in simple, powerful language so that every ordinary person could understand it. Paine wrote, "It is time to part." He argued that a king an ocean away had no right to rule a free people. His words spread like wildfire through towns and villages. For the first time, many Americans began to see independence not as a dream, but as a necessity. By spring, the Congress knew what it had to do. They needed to explain to the world why they were fighting, not just against taxes or soldiers, but for their right to exist as a free nation. In June 1776, a committee was formed to write the official declaration. It included 5 men: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Thomas Jefferson, a quiet man from Virginia with a gift for writing, was chosen to prepare the first draft. He worked alone in a small rented room in Philadelphia, writing late into the night by candlelight. For days, Jefferson wrote and rewrote his words, carefully choosing each phrase. He wanted the document to speak not only to kings and politicians, but to the hearts of all people. He wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." These words would become the soul of a new nation. On July 2, 1776, after long debate and discussion, the Congress finally voted. 12 colonies said yes to independence. New York chose to abstain, not ready to decide, but later joined the rest. 2 days later, on July 4, 1776, the final version of the Declaration was approved. The delegates took turns signing it, knowing that each stroke of the pen was an act of bravery. When John Hancock, the president of the Congress, signed his name, he wrote it in large, bold letters. He said with a smile, "There. King George can read that without his spectacles." The room was filled with both excitement and fear. Outside, the church bells of Philadelphia rang out across the city. The people cheered, waved flags, and sang songs of liberty. A new nation had been born, the United States of America. The Declaration was more than just a list of complaints against the king. It was a statement of human values. It declared that freedom and equality were not gifts from rulers, they were rights given to every person by nature and by God. These words would inspire not only Americans, but people all over the world, in France, in South America, and later in Asia and Africa. The idea of liberty was now larger than any one country. But beautiful words alone could not win independence. The war continued, harder than ever before. The British sent more ships, more soldiers, and more weapons to crush the rebellion. The Americans had courage, but they needed allies, resources, and victories. While Congress celebrated, George Washington and his army faced bitter struggles. They fought not for glory, but for survival. In the summer of 1776, Washington's troops faced the British in New York, and the result was devastating. The American army was outnumbered and inexperienced. Many soldiers were barefoot, hungry, and poorly trained. After a series of defeats, Washington was forced to retreat across New Jersey. To many, it seemed the dream of independence would die before it truly began. The mood was dark, and the winter was cruel. Yet Washington refused to give up. He told his men, the harder the conflict, the greater the triumph. His faith kept the army alive when food and hope were scarce. In December 1776, during one of the darkest moments, Washington led his troops across the icy Delaware River. In the freezing night, with snow falling around them, they attacked a group of German soldiers fighting for the British, the Hessians, in Trenton, New Jersey. The surprise attack was a success. It lifted the spirits of the people and reminded them that the cause of liberty was still alive. The Declaration of Independence had given them something more powerful than weapons, it had given them belief. Now, the world knew that America was not just fighting against something, it was fighting for something. For dignity. For equality. For the right to choose its own destiny. The dream of independence was beautiful, but the reality of war was harsh. After the excitement of the Declaration faded, the young American nation faced its greatest challenge, survival. The British Empire was strong, organized, and well-trained. Its navy ruled the seas, and its soldiers were professional warriors. The American army, led by George Washington, was made up of farmers, shopkeepers, and young boys who had never fought before. They had courage, but little experience. The war that began with hope soon turned into a long and painful test of endurance. In the winter of 1777 to 1778, Washington's army camped at a place called Valley Forge, in Pennsylvania. It was one of the coldest winters anyone could remember. The soldiers had few clothes, little food, and almost no shoes. Snow covered the ground, and many men left bloody footprints in the ice. Hunger and sickness spread through the camp. Some soldiers died quietly in their tents, while others struggled just to stand guard through the freezing nights. But even in this misery, Washington refused to surrender. He visited his men every day, speaking gently, encouraging them to hold on. He shared their pain, slept in the same cold, and prayed for their strength. A European officer named Baron von Steuben, from Prussia, arrived to help. He trained the soldiers, teaching them discipline, order, and new ways to fight. Slowly, the ragged army became stronger. The men began to march like soldiers and fight like a true army. Valley Forge became not just a place of suffering, but a place of transformation. The army that emerged in the spring was different, tougher, united, and ready. While the Americans struggled, help was coming from across the ocean. In 1778, France, inspired by the American cause, decided to join the war against Britain. French leaders admired the idea of liberty, and they wanted revenge for their own losses to Britain in earlier wars. France sent ships, money, weapons, and most importantly, soldiers. One of them was a young nobleman named Marquis de Lafayette. He became one of Washington's most trusted allies and friends. Soon, Spain and the Dutch Republic also supported the Americans. The war for American independence had now become a global conflict. Battles were fought not only in America, but on the seas and in Europe as well. Despite this new support, the war was still long and painful. Cities like New York and Philadelphia were captured by the British. Farms were burned, and families were torn apart. The economy collapsed, and paper money lost its value. Every victory seemed to come at a terrible cost. But through it all, the people refused to give up. There were moments of betrayal too. In 1780, a respected American general named Benedict Arnold shocked the nation. He secretly agreed to hand over the American fort at West Point to the British, in exchange for money and a high position. His plot was discovered just in time, and he fled to the enemy. From that day, his name became a symbol of treason. But for every traitor, there were thousands who remained loyal. Ordinary men and women risked their lives to deliver messages, hide soldiers, and fight for the dream of freedom. The war was not only fought by men. Across the colonies, women played a silent yet powerful role. They cooked for the troops, made uniforms, and cared for the wounded. Some, like Molly Pitcher, carried water to soldiers during battle and even took up arms when men fell. Others, like Abigail Adams, wrote letters reminding leaders that liberty should belong to women too. She famously told her husband, John Adams, "Remember the ladies." Their courage and strength kept families alive while their husbands and sons were away. Without the women of America, the war could never have been won. In October 1777, the Americans achieved one of their first great victories at the Battle of Saratoga in New York. British General Burgoyne's army was surrounded and forced to surrender. This victory proved to the world that the Americans could win major battles. It also convinced France to officially join the war. For the first time, hope began to grow again. The dream of independence, once fragile, now had the strength of nations behind it. Washington's army fought bravely, often retreating, but never giving up. They were not only fighting for land, they were fighting for an idea. The idea that freedom was worth every sacrifice. By 1781, the war had lasted 6 long years. Thousands had died, and many wondered how much more they could endure. But something had changed deep within the hearts of the people. They no longer saw themselves as subjects of a distant king. They had become Americans, united by shared pain, courage, and hope. In every town, in every family, the same dream lived on, to see the birth of a free nation. And soon, that dream would finally come true, in a small town in Virginia called Yorktown. After 6 long years of war, the American colonies were tired. Homes were burned, towns were destroyed, and families were broken apart. But deep in every heart, one hope still burned: freedom. The American army, though weary and hungry, refused to surrender. And soon, that hope would meet its moment of destiny in a small coastal town in Virginia, Yorktown. It was the summer of 1781. British General Charles Cornwallis had set up his camp in Yorktown, near the Chesapeake Bay. He believed he was safe there, close to the sea, where the powerful British Navy could protect him. But across the land, George Washington saw an opportunity. He learned that French ships under Admiral de Grasse were sailing toward the Chesapeake. At the same time, French soldiers under General Rochambeau were marching north to join the American army. Washington quickly formed a daring plan. He would secretly march his army, more than 400 miles, from New York to Virginia. Together with the French, he would trap Cornwallis at Yorktown and strike a final, decisive blow. For weeks, thousands of soldiers moved silently along dusty roads. Farmers and villagers watched as long lines of men, horses, and cannons passed by. No one knew where they were going. It was a secret known only to Washington and his closest officers. By September, the plan was complete. On September 28, 1781, Washington gave the order to begin the siege of Yorktown. Cannons roared across the fields day and night, shaking the earth. The air was filled with smoke and the sound of thunder as shells exploded over the British lines. For 3 weeks, the Americans and French soldiers dug trenches closer and closer to the enemy. They fired thousands of cannonballs, slowly breaking down British defenses. Washington himself stood at the front lines, watching every move. Beside him were men who had fought through years of pain, some barefoot, some hungry, but all determined. One night, a young soldier wrote in his journal, "We fight not just for victory, but for the right to live as free men." On the night of October 14, Washington ordered 2 key attacks on British forts, known as redoubts. One group of American soldiers, led by Alexander Hamilton, charged forward with bayonets, capturing their position after fierce hand-to-hand fighting. At the same time, French troops stormed another redoubt on the opposite side. Both attacks succeeded. The British lines were collapsing. For Cornwallis, there was no escape. His soldiers were exhausted, surrounded, and cut off from supplies. The once proud British army could no longer fight on. On October 19, 1781, General Cornwallis sent a messenger under a white flag. He was ready to surrender. That morning, the sky over Yorktown was clear and bright. Thousands of American and French soldiers stood silently as the British army marched out to surrender. Their drums played a slow tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." For indeed, the world had changed. Washington watched as British officers laid down their swords. He did not celebrate with pride or anger, he simply bowed his head. The long struggle was over. After 6 years of war, America had won its independence. Across the land, when the news reached the towns and farms, people wept with joy. Church bells rang, and prayers were said for the fallen. Families embraced one another, dreaming of a new life in a free country. But victory came at a heavy price. More than 25,000 Americans had lost their lives. Many more were wounded or left with scars that would never heal. Still, in their sacrifice, a new nation had been born. A nation built on courage, unity, and the belief that freedom was worth every cost. It took 2 more years before the peace was made official. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America. For the first time in history, a group of colonies had defeated an empire, not for power or gold, but for liberty. George Washington returned to his home at Mount Vernon. He said goodbye to his soldiers, thanking them for their loyalty and strength. He wished to live quietly as a farmer again, saying, "I have done my duty. Let me now enjoy the peace for which we have fought." As the sun rose over the fields of Yorktown, a new world was beginning. The United States of America stood as a symbol of hope, a place where freedom was no longer just a dream, but a living truth. Around the world, people watched and wondered, could ordinary people really govern themselves? Could liberty truly survive? The answers would come in time. But for now, the people of America looked to the future with pride, gratitude, and faith. The revolution was over. But the story of liberty was only beginning. The war had ended. The sound of cannons was gone, and the smell of gunpowder had faded into memory. The American people stood together, proud but uncertain, staring at the dawn of a new age. For the first time in history, 13 colonies were free, no longer ruled by a king, no longer bound by empire. They were now the United States of America. But freedom, they soon learned, was only the beginning of their journey. After the peace treaty in 1783, life did not suddenly become easy. The war had left towns in ruins, farms empty, and trade broken. The new country was drowning in debt. Each of the 13 states had its own government, its own money, and its own laws. Some refused to work together. Without a king, without a strong central power, the country risked falling apart before it had even begun. Leaders like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison understood this danger. They believed that liberty could only survive if the people remained united. So, they gathered once more, not to fight with weapons, but with ideas. In 1787, representatives from 12 states met in Philadelphia. They came to fix the old government, called the Articles of Confederation, which had proved too weak. But as discussions began, they realized something larger was needed, a new foundation, a new system, a new nation. The hot summer air filled with debate. Should the government be strong or limited? How should power be shared between large and small states? What rights should the people always keep safe from control? Day after day, they argued, reasoned, and wrote. Windows were kept closed to protect the secrecy of their talks. Inside, men in powdered wigs and sweat-stained coats spoke about freedom, justice, and equality. And after 4 long months, they created one of the most important documents in history. The Constitution of the United States of America. The Constitution built a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It created 3 branches, one to make laws, one to carry them out, and one to judge them fairly. No one man could ever again hold all the power. To ensure freedom, they added the Bill of Rights, 10 powerful amendments protecting speech, religion, and justice. These rights reminded the new nation that liberty was not a gift from rulers, but a natural right for all. Still, it was not perfect. Not everyone was free. Women, enslaved people, and Native Americans were left outside its promises. But the foundation had been laid. It was a beginning, a living document that could grow and improve over time. In 1789, the people turned once again to George Washington. He was the man who had led them through war, and now they asked him to lead them through peace. He became the first president of the United States. When he took the oath in New York City, his hands trembled slightly. The crowd cheered, but Washington remained humble. He said, "I walk on untrodden ground." He meant that no one had done this before. There was no example to follow, only the hope that honesty, courage, and wisdom could guide the new republic. As president, Washington helped set the traditions of democracy, peaceful debate, respect for law, and leadership through service, not power. He refused to be called Your Majesty. Instead, he chose the simple title, Mr. President. When his second term ended, he stepped down willingly, showing that no leader should rule forever. His farewell words became a message to future generations. The unity of government is your main pillar of independence. Across the oceans, people watched in wonder. In France, thinkers and revolutionaries were inspired by America's example. They saw that a nation could be built on reason and the will of its people, not on kings and crowns. Writers and poets called the United States a light to the world. The flame of liberty, lit by farmers and dreamers, now burned across the earth. But the road ahead was not easy. America still faced conflicts, divisions, and moral challenges. Yet each generation returned to the same promise. That freedom must be protected, nourished, and shared. Years later, when people looked back, they remembered not only the famous names, but also the countless ordinary souls who gave everything. The blacksmith who repaired muskets through cold nights. The mother who sent her son to war and waited for letters that never came. The young drummer who marched into battle barefoot. The nurse who tended the wounded under candlelight. They did not fight for fame. They fought for the right to live as free people, for the generations who would come after them, for us. More than 2 centuries later, the dream that began in the 18th century still lives on. The United States became a symbol of democracy, not perfect, but always striving to improve. Freedom, they learned, is not something won once and forgotten. It must be defended every day, through justice, equality, and compassion. And though the story of liberty began in America, its message belongs to all humanity. That every person, no matter where they are born, deserves to live with dignity, respect, and hope. As the sun set over the young nation, Washington stood on his farm at Mount Vernon, looking across the fields. He was older now, his hair white, his body tired. But in his eyes, there was peace. He whispered softly, "We have planted the tree of liberty. May it grow strong." And so it did. From the courage of a few rose the freedom of many. From the dream of a people was born a nation. The United States of America. The land of liberty. And so, the story of America's birth comes to an end, not with the sound of drums or the cry of victory, but with the quiet strength of a people who dared to believe in freedom. From small towns to great cities, from humble farmers to brave leaders, they built something greater than themselves, a nation founded on courage, unity, and hope. Their dream of liberty did not belong only to America, it became a message for the whole world, that freedom, once awakened, can never truly die. Today, the spirit of those early patriots still lives in every heart that stands for justice, peace, and human dignity. Because liberty is not just a part of history. It is a story we continue to write every single day. If you enjoyed this story and learned something new, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring English stories from history. Your support helps us create more lessons and stories that make English learning enjoyable and meaningful. Thank you for watching, and remember, freedom begins with knowledge.